The ballroom shimmered beneath 1,000 lights, a sea of crystal glasses and artificial smiles. Music flowed like silk across the marble floor, but the laughter had a cruel undertone that pierced through the air. Every sound felt sharpened, deliberate, a symphony built to celebrate power. At the center of it all stood Ethan Moreau, the man whose empire stretched across continents, and beside him, Amara Lou, his wife, his former pride, now his favorite target. She stood still, in a simple ivory dress that caught the light in quiet defiance. Her eyes, deep and calm, betrayed no storm, though the air around her carried whispers. The guests were watching, waiting for the next act in this unspoken performance. It was supposed to be a charity gala, a night of elegance and generosity, but the mood had turned into something venomous. Ethan lifted his glass. His smile was the practiced kind, the one that never reached his eyes. His words slithered through the microphone, charming at first, then slow and cruel. He spoke of success, of ambition, of the people who carried him there. He named his partners, his mentors, his allies. Then his gaze found Amara. He paused, letting silence stretch thin like a blade. And finally he said it, that line that would echo through her bones for years to come. Some people are born to stand beside success, not to own it. The crowd erupted in laughter, gentle at first, then swelling. The sound was thunderous, humiliating, merciless. Crystal clinked, shoulders shook, faces glowed with amusement. No one dared to look at her for too long. They didn't want to catch her shame. Amara didn't move. Her hand tightened on the stem of her glass until her knuckles turned white. Inside her, a slight sound broke, something between a sob and a spark. Clara Nguyen, her closest friend, watched from across the room. Her eyes widened, heart sinking. She mouthed a silent plea for Amara to leave, but Amara stayed head high, posture straight. The light from the chandeliers fell across her face, and for a fleeting second she looked like marble, cold, sculpted, eternal. Ethan turned away from her, laughing with Leona Cruz, the woman who had replaced affection with admiration. Leona's red dress shimmered like temptation, her laughter trailing behind Ethan's arrogance. They looked perfect together, two people too beautiful to be kind. Amara felt the air tighten around her. Every second stretched into eternity. The world blurred at the edges as whispers crawled through the tables. Words like pity, divorce, humiliation, and failure danced through the air like ghosts. Her mind drifted, back to the first time she had met Ethan. Back when he was not a god, but a man with dirt under his nails and dreams in his eyes. They had built his empire together, one sleepless night at a time. She had believed in him before the money, before the fame. She had stitched his first suit, poured coffee over spreadsheets, and answered calls from investors who didn't yet know his name. And now he laughed at her, as though she were a stranger who had never mattered. Her reflection in the mirrored wall caught her attention. She looked like someone else. The girl who once smiled beside him was gone. What stood there now was a ghost of quiet strength, holding the shards of her dignity close like a weapon. Mr. Vincent Hale stood near the bar, watching too. He had once been humiliated by Ethan at another gala years ago. Tonight, as he observed the same cruelty directed toward Amara, something in his chest shifted. The spark of revenge flickered quietly behind his calm eyes. The music swelled again, the laughter softened, the guests moved on, their cruelty fading into polite distraction. But the damage had been done. The invisible line between Amara and Ethan had finally snapped. She placed her glass down carefully, the sound of crystal on marble louder than the orchestra. Ethan didn't even glance her way. She took one slow breath, then another. Her heart pounded, but her face remained serene. Her mind repeated a single thought. Remember this moment. Every laugh, every stare, every cruel word. Leona brushed past her with a smile dripping in pity. Such a shame, she whispered, enough for only Amara to hear. You never knew how to play in his world. Amara turned her head slightly, her gaze locking with Leona's. For the first time that night, she smiled. It was not a smile of defeat, it was a promise. Ethan raised his glass again, the show continuing, the crowd cheering. Amara stepped away from him, each heel click echoing across the marble floor like the sound of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Outside the ballroom, The night air hit her skin like cold fire. The city glittered below, alive, uncaring. She stood beneath the golden arches of the hotel entrance, her breath trembling, her hands shaking slightly. The laughter from inside still rang in her ears. Clara found her minutes later, coat in hand, eyes wet. "Amara, let's go. You don't have to stand there anymore." Amara didn't respond at first. Her gaze lingered on the horizon, where the skyline cut through the dark. She finally spoke, her voice steady and low. He made the mistake of thinking this was the end. Her friend hesitated. The end of what? Amara turned, her eyes suddenly fierce. The end of me. A car pulled up. The driver opened the door, waiting. Amara slid inside, her back straight, her silence heavy. The rain had begun to fall, tapping against the window like a heartbeat. As the car pulled away, she looked out at the city lights reflecting on the wet glass. The laughter behind her grew distant, softer, smaller. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Freedom, sharp and fragile, blooming beneath her pain. Ethan Moreau remained in the ballroom, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. To him, it was another night of control, another display of dominance. To her, it was the last night she would ever bow her head. In that moment, without witnesses or applause, Amara Lou made a silent vow. She would never beg for respect again. She would build her own empire, one that no one could take or mock. And one day the world would remember not the laughter, but the woman who walked away from it. The rain did not stop that night. It came down in silver threads, washing the streets of the city clean of its glitter and lies. Amara stood by the window of her suite, the one that no longer felt like home, and watched the storm blur the skyline. Behind her, silence filled the room where laughter used to live. Every trace of Ethan was still there, his cufflinks on the dresser, his jacket hanging carelessly over a chair, the scent of his cologne still lingering in the air like arrogance that refused to fade. She strolled through the room, fingertips brushing the edges of things that had once been theirs. The photographs on the nightstand caught her attention. One showed them smiling in a garden years ago, sun pouring through the leaves, promise alive in their eyes. She stared at it until the image began to blur, not from tears but from the cold detachment setting in. Then she turned the frame face down. Her phone buzzed. Clara again. Amara picked it up, hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was soft but urgent. "Amara, please stay with me tonight. You shouldn't be alone." Her reply came after a long pause. "I'm fine." Clara sighed. "No one is fine after that kind of humiliation. He meant to break you, not hurt you. There's a difference." Amara's voice was calm. Then he failed at both. She hung up before her friend could say more. The sound of the call ending felt final, like the closing of a door she could never reopen. She turned back to the window and saw her reflection ghosted over the storm. The woman in the glass looked older, sharper, colder. She began to pack, not in haste, not in panic. Each movement was deliberate, like a ritual. She folded her clothes, slid them into the suitcase, one by one, as though burying her old life. She didn't take everything, only what was hers before Ethan, before the empire, before the noise. A photograph of her parents, a worn leather notebook filled with ideas she once dreamed of pursuing, a single silver bracelet that had belonged to her mother. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the room for a heartbeat. In that brief light, Amara caught sight of herself in the mirror again, standing tall in the center of the storm. She almost didn't recognize the strength in her own stance. Downstairs, the house was quiet. The servants had long gone to their quarters, the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. She walked barefoot across the marble floor, the click of her suitcase wheels echoing faintly behind her. The silence was comforting in a strange way. She reached the front door and paused. For a moment, she thought she might turn back. Not for Ethan, but for the years they had shared, for the fragments of tenderness buried under years of pride. But the memory of his laughter, the sharp, cutting sound of it, rose again. The echo of the ballroom filled her head. The decision solidified. Amara opened the door. The rain greeted her like a baptism. It soaked through her coat instantly, cold and cleansing. She walked down the steps slowly, not running from anything, but walking toward something unknown. The city lights shimmered through the downpour like distant promises. The driver was waiting by the gate, umbrella in hand. He looked at her with surprise. "Mrs. Marifest." "Moreau, are you?" "Not Mrs. Moreau, not anymore. Just Amara." She took the umbrella from his hand, thanked him, and told him to stay. Then she walked into the rain alone. Each step away from the mansion felt like shedding a skin. The further she went, the lighter she became. Her heels clicked against the pavement, her hair clung to her face, and her suitcase rolled behind her like a quiet witness. She did not look back once. The streets were nearly empty at that hour. Neon signs flickered, puddles reflected the world upside down, and the city breathed with the hum of distant engines. Amara found herself walking without a destination, guided only by instinct. She didn't want comfort, she wanted clarity. She stopped by a small cafe that was still open, its warm yellow light spilling onto the wet sidewalk. Inside, a young barista looked up as she entered, startled by the sight of a woman in an evening gown, drenched and silent. "Coffee," she said softly. "Black." The barista nodded and hurried to prepare it. Amara sat by the window, watching the rain trace thin rivers down the glass. When the cup arrived, she wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her palms. For the first time in years, no one expected anything from her. She wasn't Mrs. Moreau, the billionaire's wife. She wasn't the woman behind the empire. She was just Amara Lou, sitting alone in a cafe, trying to remember who she had been before the world told her who to be. She thought of her parents, of their small shop in Hong Kong, of how they had built everything with their hands and kindness. Her father used to say that pride is only beautiful when it is quiet. Ethan had never understood that. His pride was loud, demanding, hungry. It had consumed everything, even her. Amara opened her notebook, the old leather one she had kept hidden for years. Inside were sketches of designs, notes for a startup idea she had once dreamed of, a foundation to help women rebuild their lives after failure. She had written the words 5 years ago, then abandoned them when Ethan said it was childish. She looked at the page and felt something stir, a tiny ember of purpose. She closed the notebook gently, as if protecting a fragile secret. Outside, a figure appeared under the awning. It was Clara, breathless and soaked, eyes full of worry. She spotted Amara through the window and came inside. "You really were going to disappear, weren't you?" she said, sitting down across from her. Amara didn't answer. She just pushed the cup of coffee toward her friend. Clara took it, warmed her hands, and exhaled. "He'll come looking for you," she said. Amara shook her head. "Number, he won't. He doesn't chase what he thinks he owns." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain. Then Clara spoke again, quieter this time. "What will you do now?" Amara looked out at the storm, her reflection merging with the city lights. The answer came slowly, but it felt inevitable. "I'll start again from nothing, if I must, but this time, it will be mine." When they finally stepped back into the rain, the world felt different. The storm had softened to a drizzle, the sky beginning to pale at the edges with the first hint of dawn. Clara hailed a taxi, but Amara hesitated before getting in. She turned one last time toward the direction of the mansion she had left behind. In the distance, lightning flickered once more. For a moment, she imagined Ethan standing in one of those high windows, looking down, realizing too late that she was gone. The thought didn't hurt as much as she expected. It didn't hurt at all. She got into the car, closing the door with quiet finality. The city began to move past in streaks of gold and gray. As the taxi drove her away from everything she once knew, Amara Lou leaned her head against the glass and whispered to herself words no one else could hear. "This isn't running. This is rebirth." The rain slowed, the streets grew calm, and the night began to break open into morning. She didn't know where she was going yet, but for the first time in a long time, she knew exactly who she was. The morning came softly, pale and uninviting, the kind of light that revealed everything without warmth. Amara stood by the window of a small apartment overlooking the edge of the city. The place smelled of paint and dust, the scent of things newly born. She had rented it the night she left, using cash she kept hidden for emergencies, though she had never truly believed she would need it. Now it was all she had. The walls were bare, the furniture was second-hand, each piece a story she didn't know. The rain from the night before had stopped, but its memory lingered in the gray puddles below. Somewhere, a train passed, the sound distant and steady. The city outside her window felt different now, no longer the stage of her humiliation, but a landscape of possibility. She brewed a cup of coffee on a small stove. The taste was bitter and cheap, but it was hers. She sat by the single table in the room, opened her notebook, and turned to the page she had looked at in the cafe the night before. The sketches of business models, the designs, the list of ideas written in rushed handwriting, it all felt like a message from a younger version of herself, one who had believed in creation more than survival. Amara traced the words with her fingers. Lu Foundation, the name she had written at the top of the page years ago, seemed almost prophetic now. She whispered it quietly, testing how it sounded in the silence. It felt right. The first few days passed in solitude. She barely left the apartment, except to buy food and the cheapest internet plan she could find. Her savings were limited, but her determination was not. She began researching again, reading about social startups, microfunding systems, women-led initiatives in underdeveloped regions. The fire in her grew brighter with each article, each success story. At night, exhaustion came easily, but sleep did not. Memories of the gala haunted her. The flash of cameras, Ethan's laughter, the sound of the crowd. Sometimes she would wake up with her heart pounding, reaching for a pillow as though it could silence the echoes. But each time she remembered his face, the sharp cruelty in his eyes, she reminded herself, the pain was her proof of being alive. On the fifth morning, Clara visited. She arrived with a bag of groceries and her usual mixture of worry and warmth. "You look thinner," she said, unloading vegetables on the counter. "I feel lighter," Amara replied. Clara smiled faintly. "You always did find poetry in pain." They sat together by the window. Clara looked around the small apartment. "It's not much," she said softly, "but it's a start." Amara nodded. "That's all I need." After Clara left, Amara began making calls. She reached out to old acquaintances from her university days, investors she had met briefly before Ethan's shadow covered her identity. Most didn't remember her or pretended not to. Some offered polite refusals, others hung up, but she didn't stop. Days turned into weeks. The city shifted around her as if to test her endurance. She learned how to stretch a meal across 2 days, how to repair a leaking faucet, how to live quietly. Each morning she rose with a plan, and each night she collapsed with a sense of forward motion, however small. One evening, while reviewing her notes, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen surprised her, Mr. Vincent Hale. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Lu," he began, his voice steady and composed. "I've been following your progress. You've been contacting the right people, though they don't yet see it. How do you know what I've been doing?" she asked. A small pause. "Let's say I have a talent for observing ambition." I remember that night. I remember how he laughed. It wasn't just cruelty, it was weakness pretending to be power. Amara said nothing. Hale continued. "I have an offer. Not a gift, not pity, a partnership. I want to fund your idea." She frowned, unsure whether to trust him. "Why me?" "Because you have what he lost. Discipline without ego, vision without arrogance. And I enjoy poetic justice." The line went quiet for a moment. Amara could hear her own heartbeat. Then she spoke, her voice calm. "I don't want revenge, Mr. Hale." He laughed softly. "Good, that means you'll win." When the call ended, she sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing into her chest. She didn't know whether to believe him, but something in her shifted. The possibility of creation, real creation, no longer felt distant. The next morning, she met him in a modest cafe downtown. He was older than she remembered, his hair silver, his eyes sharp and kind. They talked for hours, not about Ethan, but about structure, sustainability, and purpose. By the time they parted, he had agreed to become her silent investor. She walked out of that meeting feeling something she hadn't felt in years, momentum. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of work. She set up a small office space in an old warehouse district, barely more than a room with peeling paint and a desk. But to her, it was sacred ground. Jacob Tran, a lawyer recommended by Hale, joined her soon after. Together, they built the legal framework for the Liu Foundation. The mission was simple yet powerful: to fund and mentor women whose voices had been silenced by failure or circumstance. Amara worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, surviving on coffee and the quiet thrill of purpose. Her old life felt like another lifetime, one that no longer defined her. Sometimes, as she locked up the office at night, she would see her reflection in the glass door. The woman looking back at her wasn't the broken wife from the Gala. She was something else now, someone forged from ruin. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan's empire began to tremble. Contracts fell through. Investors withdrew. The media whispered about internal instability. Amara didn't celebrate it, though she heard the news from Clara one evening. She simply nodded, a calm acknowledgement of balance returning to the world. "He's losing everything," Clara said quietly. "Everyone loses something eventually," Amara replied. "It's what they become after that matters." The first success of the Liu Foundation came 2 months later. A young woman named Sophia presented a plan for a sustainable textile startup. Amara listened, advised, and funded her with a small grant. When Sophia's tears of gratitude came, Amara only smiled. She saw herself in that woman, the hunger, the hope, the strength to begin again. That night, Amara stood by her apartment window, city lights glowing beneath her like constellations. She held her notebook now filled with pages of plans, numbers, and dreams reborn. The rain began again, softer this time, almost kind. She thought of how endings and beginnings often looked the same, quiet, gray, uncertain. She closed her eyes and whispered the words she had written years ago on the first page. "From ashes we rise." And as she stood there, surrounded by the hum of the sleeping city, Amara Liu finally understood that every humiliation, every heartbreak, every night she had endured was not destruction. It was preparation. It was late evening when the call came again. The city was sinking into darkness, the hum of traffic fading into the low murmur of rain against the window. Amara sat at her desk, surrounded by folders, reports, and coffee cups gone cold. The small office glowed under the soft light of a single lamp. Her foundation was growing faster than she had dared to imagine. What had started as a fragile idea now pulsed with life. Women were working, calling, building something new every day. Yet beneath that quiet success, there was a restlessness that refused to sleep. The phone vibrated, interrupting her thoughts. The number was familiar now, she answered. Mr. Hale's voice was calm as always. "Miss Liu, I thought you might want to hear some news." She leaned back in her chair. News about what? About him, Ethan Moreau. The name still carried weight, though it no longer hurt. Amara's fingers paused above the open folder. "Go on." "He's losing ground. His company's value dropped 12% last quarter. Investors are leaving. It's poetic in a way. The man who thought he could never fall is learning gravity." Amara said nothing. Hale continued, his tone softer now. "I know what you're thinking. You don't want to involve yourself in his ruin. But I'll tell you this, there are moments when justice whispers, not shouts. And perhaps, my dear, this is one of those moments." She smiled faintly, though he could not see it. "Justice or revenge, Mr. Hale, which are you offering?" He chuckled. "The difference lies in the heart of the one who acts." When the call ended, the room fell silent again. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Amara stood and walked to the window. Across the skyline, lightning lit up the towers of the financial district, the identical towers that once bore Ethan's name in polished silver. She watched the light flicker and fade, as if the universe itself were mocking him. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to think of him not as an enemy, but as a man. She imagined him alone in his glass office, surrounded by silence and regret, trying to understand how everything he had built was slipping away. A part of her pitied him. Another part did not. The next morning, Clara arrived earlier than usual, her face bright with a strange excitement. "Did you hear?" she asked, dropping her umbrella by the door. "Ethan's company is being audited. There's talk of corruption, misused funds, and a scandal involving Leona. Amara looked up from her desk, expression unreadable. People destroy themselves faster than anyone else can. Clara frowned. Don't you want to see him pay after everything he did? Amara closed her notebook gently. Wanting and needing are not the same thing. Clara sighed and changed the subject, but Amara's mind stayed fixed on the idea, not of revenge, but of consequence. There was a difference, though a fine one. Later that day, as the rain returned, Jacob entered her office carrying a file. His usually composed face looked troubled. "There's something you should see," he said. He laid the folder on her desk and stepped back. Inside were printed reports, public records showing that Ethan's company had acquired several properties under shell names. Among them, one was suspiciously connected to an old project Amara had helped design years ago, back when they were partners. Her pulse quickened. Jacob pointed to a signature at the bottom of the document. "Your work," he said. "The designs, the models, it's yours. They're using your original blueprints without credit." For a moment, the world tilted. She could almost hear Ethan's voice again, dismissive, confident. "You wouldn't understand the business side of things, Amara. Let me handle it." She closed the folder. Her voice, when it came, was calm but cold. "We'll handle it legally. No spectacle, no noise." Jacob nodded. "That's the most innovative approach." But that night, when everyone had gone and the office was dark, Amara stayed behind. She sat in silence, fingers resting lightly on the folder. The anger inside her was quiet but sharp, like a blade hidden beneath silk. She didn't want to destroy him, she wanted truth. She wanted him to see the reflection of what he had become. A week later, Hale invited her to dinner. The restaurant was dim, candlelit, filled with the low murmur of old jazz. He greeted her with the grace of a man who had waited a long time to have this conversation. "You've done remarkable work," he said after the waiter left. "The Liu Foundation is in the news. You've made something honest in a world built on illusions." Amara smiled faintly. "Thank you, but you didn't invite me here for compliments." "No," he admitted. "I wanted to discuss a possibility. Ethan's company is weakening. If we acquire certain divisions quietly, we can take control of his board within months." She looked at him, her expression still. "You want me to take his company?" He met her gaze. "I want you to take back what he stole. Call it justice, call it irony. I call it restoration." Amara sat back, thoughtful. "And if I refuse, then someone else will do it. Someone without your restraint." She stared at her glass, the wine catching the light like blood. That night, she walked home alone through the streets. The air was cold and sharp, the city pulsing with neon and noise. Her reflection followed her in every shop window, in every puddle. She thought of all the women she had helped, each one building something new out of what had been taken from them. Perhaps this was no different. Possibly reclaiming her name, her work, her dignity was not revenge. Maybe it was restoration, just as Hale had said. By the time she reached her apartment, the decision had already formed within her. She opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence across the top of a clean page. To take back what was stolen is not vengeance. It is balance. The following morning she met with Hale and Jacob. The plan was precise, strategic, ruthless in its efficiency. Over the next several weeks, they began acquiring silent shares through intermediaries. Every move was quiet, every signature deliberate. Ethan's empire was bleeding from within, and no one outside the circle suspected where the cut had begun. Amara kept her distance, her emotions locked away. Yet sometimes when she looked out at the skyline at night, she could almost hear that same cruel laughter from the Gala years ago. It no longer wounded her. It reminded her of how far she had come. She had walked away with nothing, and now she held in her hands the power to decide the fate of the man who once mocked her. The world would call it revenge, she would call it balance. And somewhere deep inside her chest, a quiet voice whispered, not of hatred, but of reckoning. It told her that the wheel had turned, and that what began in humiliation would end in truth. The whisper grew stronger with each passing day, until it no longer felt like temptation, but destiny. The morning light crept through the blinds of Amara's office, thin and golden, slicing across a table cluttered with contracts, architectural drawings, and financial reports. The room smelled faintly of ink and ambition. Every detail of the Lu Foundation had once been born of necessity, but now it was precision, strategy, and strength. Amara stood by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, the skyline of the city rising behind her like a promise waiting to be claimed. Jacob entered quietly, carrying a folder pressed close to his chest. He had the look of a man who had been awake for days. "You should see this," he said, laying the papers on her desk. "Hale's latest acquisition went through this morning. That gives us 22% of Moreau Global's shares." Amara turned, her voice calm. "And the rest? Hale is negotiating with 2 other silent partners. They're willing to sell if the price is right. It's only a matter of time." She nodded slowly. "Time is the only currency that matters." Jacob studied her expression. "You're not doing this out of anger, are you?" She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I'm doing it out of truth. Every empire built on deceit must eventually answer to honesty." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Then we'll give them honesty, one document at a time." For weeks, the plan unfolded like clockwork. Hale coordinated acquisitions with the elegance of a chess master, moving unseen pieces across the board. Jacob managed the legal complexities, crafting layers of confidentiality that even the most curious investigators couldn't unravel. Amara oversaw every detail, her days consumed by meetings, calls, and endless signatures. She worked not for revenge, but for clarity. Every stroke of her pen was a declaration that she existed beyond Ethan's shadow. At night, the city outside her apartment seemed alive with possibilities. Neon light painted the walls, and the sound of traffic below blended with the hum of her thoughts. She kept a map pinned above her desk, red strings connecting companies, investors, and shell corporations, all leading back to one name, Ethan Moreau. It was not obsession, it was architecture. She was building something new from the ruins. One evening, Hale invited her to his private study. The room smelled of leather and old paper. Shelves of books lined the walls, and a decanter of amber whiskey gleamed in the soft light. He poured 2 glasses and handed her one. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "My wife. She built everything beside me, and I let pride ruin it. Ethan did the same, only worse." Amara took the glass but didn't drink. "Pride builds walls," she said, "but pain builds foundations." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose that's why you're winning." They reviewed the next phase. Within 3 months, the Liu Foundation would hold controlling interest in one of Ethan's subsidiary firms, a branch critical to his international operations. Through that, they would gain influence over his company's direction. It was not destruction, it was quiet redirection. The following weeks were a storm of momentum. Amara met with bankers, investors, and analysts. She spoke with poise, her voice steady and persuasive. The people who had once dismissed her now listened. Her reputation as a strategist spread quickly, whispered among circles that once belonged to Ethan. She didn't seek attention, but attention found her. Clara watched all this with pride and worry. One night she visited the office and leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You're becoming everything he thought you couldn't be," she said. Amara smiled faintly. Then perhaps he should have imagined more. But Clara didn't smile. "Just promise me one thing. When you finally take everything back, don't lose the part of you that wanted to build, not destroy." Amara paused, then nodded. "I promise." Still, the closer she came to victory, the heavier the air around her became. She began to see Ethan's name in every headline, every conversation. The media spoke of instability at Moreau Global, rumors of internal conflict and leadership failures. Leona's name appeared too, attached to whispers of mismanagement. The empire that once seemed untouchable now trembled under its own weight. Amara watched from a distance, detached yet aware. Her actions were deliberate and unseen, her influence invisible but profound. The irony was almost too sharp to bear. The same woman he had mocked now held the strings that determined his company's survival. One afternoon, Jacob burst into her office, breathless. "It's done. Hale secured the last division." You now hold majority control of Moro Global through the subsidiaries." For a moment, silence filled the room. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken meaning. Amara set down her pen and looked at the papers in front of her. The company seal glimmered faintly in the light. "So this is what power feels like," she murmured. Jacob smiled. "Power feels like this only when it's earned." That night, Amara returned to her apartment later than usual. She made tea, sat by the window, and opened her notebook. She flipped through pages filled with goals, strategies, and old notes, until she reached the first page, the one with her vow written in careful ink. "From ashes, we rise." She traced the words slowly, feeling the weight of their truth. Her phone buzzed, a message from Hale. "Board meeting in 2 weeks. He'll be there. Ethan." The name flickered across the screen like a spark from a dying fire. She stared at it for a long time, her reflection pale in the glass. 2 weeks. That was all the time left before everything shifted again. In the days that followed, she prepared with quiet precision. Her team assembled reports, projections, and statements. She practiced her presentation, not because she doubted her skill, but because she wanted to face him without tremor or hesitation. On the eve of the meeting, Clara called. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "No," Amara answered. "I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "For the truth to finally speak." The next morning, the city rose in silver mist. Amara walked to her car, the streets still empty. The air was cool and sharp, the kind that wakes something ancient inside the soul. She felt no fear, only focus. Every step she took was steady, deliberate, soundless. She arrived at the headquarters of Moro Global just as the sun broke through the clouds. The building loomed above her like a monument to arrogance. She paused at the entrance, looking up at the glass facade. Once she had walked these halls beside Ethan, full of belief. Now she walked alone, full of certainty. Inside, employees moved like ghosts, unaware of the storm about to break. Amara entered the boardroom with Hale and Jacob at her side. The long table gleamed beneath the cold lights, and at its far end sat Ethan Moro, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met for the first time in years. The silence between them was vast, electric, filled with every memory they had never spoken aloud. "Good morning," she said simply. Ethan nodded slowly. "Miss Liu." Her voice did not waver. "Let's begin." In that instant, the air shifted. The blueprint she had drawn in secret was no longer a plan, it was reality. And though the room was filled with polished men and expensive suits, it was Amara Liu who held the architecture of power in her steady, graceful hands. The boardroom was a cathedral of glass and silence. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, painting cold lines across the polished table. Every chair was filled. Men in dark suits whispered in low voices. Papers shuffled, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and tension. At the head of the table sat Ethan Moro, his face expressionless, but his hands betraying a faint tremor as he tapped a pen against his notes. When Amara entered, the room changed. Conversations died mid-sentence. The rustle of paper stopped. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked to her seat. She wore a white suit, immaculate and understated, her hair pulled back with calm precision. The light from the windows caught the silver pin on her lapel, the emblem of the Liu Foundation, and for a fleeting moment, even those who had never met her seemed to recognize her power. Ethan's eyes followed her. He looked older now, lines etched around his mouth, the sharp arrogance of his youth dulled by strain. He had not expected her to appear here, in this room that had always belonged to him. For a second, he could not speak. Then he forced a smile. "Welcome, Miss Liu. I must say, it's been a long time." Amara took her seat opposite him, the corners of her lips lifted slightly. "Long enough for the world to change." Hale leaned forward. "Let's begin." The meeting unfolded with quiet intensity. Financial reports, restructuring plans, and strategic proposals filled the air like a chess game played with human lives. Ethan tried to maintain his composure, but every slide, every statement, revealed how deeply his company had been compromised. Departments he believed loyal were under new management. Contracts he thought secured had been reassigned. Finally, Jacob spoke, his tone measured and precise. As of last quarter, a controlling interest in Moreau Global's core subsidiaries is now held by Liu Foundation Investments. Effective immediately, board decisions will require joint approval from both parties. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan's pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the table. The sound small, but deafening. He stared at the documents in disbelief. This must be some kind of mistake. Hale folded his hands. There's no mistake. The numbers speak for themselves. Ethan turned his gaze toward Amara. You did this. She met his eyes, calm and steady. I restored what you once tried to erase. He chuckled, though there was no humor in it. You think this makes you powerful. You believe this brings balance. No, she said softly. Balance was never yours to give. The meeting continued, but the outcome was already written. By the time it ended, Ethan's authority had been reduced to ceremony. His voice still echoed through the room, but it no longer carried weight. When the last document was signed and the board members dispersed, Amara remained seated, her gaze fixed on the skyline outside. The city glowed beneath the morning light, vast and indifferent. She could feel Ethan's eyes on her, heavy and searching. He broke the silence first. Tell me, was this your plan all along? To take what I built. She turned to him. You built nothing alone, Ethan. You built on backs you never saw, on hands you never thanked. He leaned back, the mask slipping from his face. You think you're better than me. No, she said, her tone still quiet. I think I learned from you. He looked away, his jaw tight. There was something hollow in his expression now, a man facing the reflection of his own choices. He gathered his papers and stood abruptly. This isn't over. It already is, Amara replied. You just haven't accepted it yet. He walked out without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the city below. Later that evening, Amara stood on the balcony of her apartment, the wind pulling at her hair. The city stretched endlessly before her, alive with light and noise. She thought of Ethan, not with anger, but with a strange detached clarity. He had been the architect of his own downfall, yet he would never understand that his greatest mistake had not been arrogance, but underestimating silence. Behind her, Clara entered with 2 cups of tea. So, it's done, she said. Amara nodded. It's done. Clara handed her a cup. I saw the news already. The headlines are brutal. They're calling it the quiet coup. Amara smiled faintly. The truth doesn't need to shout. They stood together, watching the lights flicker across the skyline. Clara glanced at her friend, curiosity in her eyes. Do you feel satisfied? Amara took a slow sip of her tea. Satisfaction is temporary. Peace is harder. You think he'll ever understand what you did? But maybe one day he'll understand why. Across town, Ethan sat alone in his office. The city lights reflected in the dark glass behind him. His empire was still standing, but it no longer belonged to him. Leona had stopped answering his calls. His closest advisors were silent. The corridors that once echoed with his authority now hummed with whispers he couldn't control. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling in his hand. For the first time, he wondered what it felt like to be the one left behind. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk, himself and Amara, years ago, smiling at a groundbreaking ceremony. He remembered her eyes then, full of hope and belief, and something inside him twisted. He smashed the glass against the wall, shards scattering across the floor. But even as the picture shattered, her image remained burned into his memory, unbroken. Back in her apartment, Amara placed her tea down and opened her notebook. She flipped to a clean page and wrote a single line. Power without conscience is a burden, not a crown. She stared at the words for a long time before closing the book. The rain began again, soft and rhythmic against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, echoing like a memory that refused to fade. Amara stood and walked to the window. She placed a hand against the cool glass, watching the city blur beneath the rain. It was strange, she thought, how time folded in on itself. The laughter from that night at the gala, the humiliation that had once broken her, it all felt distant now, like a story that had happened to someone else. But the echoes remained. They always would, not as wounds, but as reminders. Every scar she carried had become part of the foundation she stood on. The city lights flickered once more, reflected in her eyes. She whispered into the quiet, "From ashes, we rise." And somewhere, deep within the storm, the past finally began to let go. The morning of the shareholders' summit arrived with a sharp, crystalline chill. The city glimmered beneath a veil of fog, towers piercing through the gray sky like memories refusing to fade. Inside the glass atrium of the Moreau Global headquarters, every step echoed with anticipation. Reporters waited outside behind velvet ropes, cameras flashing in restless bursts. Inside, the boardroom was immaculate. Polished floors, leather chairs, and the quiet hum of money and fear. Amara entered with the calm precision of someone who no longer sought approval. Her presence was quiet but magnetic. Heads turned, conversations faltered. She wore black this time, sleek, simple, sovereign. The soft click of her heels was the only sound as she crossed the marble floor toward the front of the room. Ethan was already there. He stood near the window, staring at the skyline with the stillness of a man cornered by his own reflection. When he turned, their eyes met across the expanse of the room. There was no anger in hers, only clarity. He looked exhausted, like a man who had been running for years without ever reaching solid ground. "Good morning, Mr. Moreau," she said evenly. He nodded stiffly. "Miss Liu, I didn't expect you to attend in person." She smiled faintly. "You never expect me, Ethan. That's always been your weakness." Murmurs rippled through the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. Hale sat near the end of the table, expression unreadable, while Jacob arranged documents with quiet efficiency. Ethan gestured toward the table. "Please, have a seat." "I prefer to stand," Amara replied. "It won't take long." Her tone was gentle but unwavering. She placed a thin folder on the table. Inside were the latest financial statements, projections, and a restructuring plan that bore her signature. Every page represented months of meticulous work, of strategy built from discipline rather than rage. "We've completed the audit," she said, addressing the board. "The findings are clear. Mismanagement and unethical contracts have placed this company at risk. The Liu Foundation has no intention of allowing further decay." Ethan's voice cut through the air. "You mean to replace me?" Amara met his gaze. "I mean to rebuild what you corrupted." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you've won. You think this makes you my equal. No, Ethan, I never wanted to be your equal. I wanted to be free." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Hale spoke, his tone calm but final. "The vote has already been cast, Ethan. The majority stands with Miss Liu. You will remain in an advisory capacity for 6 months. After that, your position will be reviewed." Ethan's face hardened. He turned to the others, but no one spoke. The empire he had ruled with pride now stood silent before him. Amara's voice softened. "This doesn't have to be the end, Ethan. You can still make something meaningful out of what's left, but it has to begin with honesty." "Honesty," he echoed bitterly. "You talk about honesty after everything you've done?" She looked at him steadily. "I built nothing on lies. Can you say the same?" The weight of her words lingered. He looked away, his shoulders sinking. The meeting ended soon after. The board members filed out quietly, whispering to one another. When the room finally emptied, only the two of them remained. For a long time, neither spoke. The city's hum filled the silence, a reminder that life continued beyond their pride. Ethan broke it first. "Do you remember the night of the gala? The way they laughed?" Amara turned toward the window. "I remember everything." He walked to the table and rested his hands on it, as if steadying himself. "I thought you would break that night. That was the point, to make you small enough to need me again." Her voice was calm. "I did break. But the thing about breaking, Ethan, is that you get to choose what shape you return in." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I underestimated you." "No," she said softly. "You never really saw me." She gathered her papers, closing the folder with deliberate care. As she did, Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter. "What happens now? You rebuild, I lead. And maybe one day you understand what that means." She walked toward the door. He called after her, "Amara." She paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle. "I used to think you were my greatest mistake. Now I think you might be my only truth." She turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "That's the tragedy of men like you. You only recognize truth when it no longer belongs to you." Then she left. Outside, the cameras flared to life as soon as she stepped into the atrium. Microphones thrust forward, questions rising in a blur of sound. "Miss Liu, how does it feel to take control? Do you plan to remove Ethan Moreau entirely? Is this revenge?" Amara smiled faintly, but didn't stop walking. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the quiet certainty of a storm that had already passed. "This is not revenge. This is responsibility." Her car waited at the curb. As she slid inside, the noise faded behind the glass. The driver pulled away, and the city began to move past her in streaks of silver and light. She leaned back against the seat, eyes half closed, feeling the weight of years start to lift. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The air tasted like rain and new beginnings. Later that night, she stood alone in her penthouse, the one she had purchased quietly months ago, high above the city. The same skyline stretched before her, but this time it was hers. She stepped out onto the balcony, her hair catching the breeze. Below, the city pulsed with life, unaware of the quiet revolutions unfolding within it. Clara called just before midnight. "I saw the press conference," she said. "You looked untouchable." Amara laughed softly. "I'm just human, Clara, a very tired one." "You did it, Amara. You took back everything." "No," she said, "I took back myself." When the call ended, she stood in silence, watching the city lights shimmer like constellations scattered across the earth. The night was calm, the air cool and endless. Somewhere far below, she could almost hear the echo of laughter from that night long ago, the laughter that had once broken her. But now, it was nothing more than a distant sound, stripped of its power. She whispered into the quiet. "You were right, Clara. I didn't need to destroy him. I only needed to remember who I was." The wind carried her words away into the vastness of the city. Inside, the clock ticked softly, marking the passage of time, marking the rhythm of rebirth. Amara turned from the balcony and looked around the room. It was not filled with luxury, but with peace. Books, papers, and a few plants lined the space. On the table near the window lay her old notebook, the one she had carried through every storm. She opened it to the first page and wrote a new line beneath her vow. "Freedom is not given, it is reclaimed." Then she closed it, her reflection blending with the glittering city beyond the glass. In that moment, she realized that the world no longer owed her anything. She had already taken back everything that mattered: herself, her dignity, her peace. And this time, no one could ever take it away again. The following months unfolded like the slow unraveling of a silk thread. What had once been a fortress of power began to crumble piece by piece, quietly and without mercy. Ethan Moreau's empire, once untouchable, was sinking beneath the weight of its own arrogance. The newspapers no longer spoke of his innovation or leadership. Instead, they spoke of failed contracts, legal disputes, and investors withdrawing overnight. His name, once gilded in admiration, had turned into a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and cafes. Amara watched it all from a distance. She read the reports with calm detachment, her emotions steady. She did not rejoice, nor did she pity him. The fall of Ethan Moreau was not her victory. It was his consequence. The world was simply catching up to what she had known all along. Power without purpose devours itself. In the office of the Liu Foundation, the air was bright and alive with progress. New projects were launching, more women were being funded, and communities were rising from the ground with determination that mirrored Amara's own journey. The space was filled with the sounds of typing, laughter, and quiet resolve. Amara moved among her team with ease, answering questions, offering encouragement, guiding rather than commanding. To them, she was not a symbol of vengeance, but of resilience. One afternoon, Clara appeared in her office doorway holding a newspaper. She hesitated before speaking. "He's losing everything, Amara. The board voted to sell the last of his assets. Leona's gone, the mansion's been seized, he's completely alone." Amara looked up from her desk. Her eyes were calm, but something flickered behind them, a quiet recognition of inevitability. The empire he built on cruelty was bound to collapse. "Do you ever think about him?" Clara asked gently. "Sometimes," Amara replied, "but not in the way I used to. I think about who I became because of him, not who I was with him." Clara nodded slowly. "You've forgiven him, haven't you?" Amara didn't answer right away. Forgiveness wasn't something she had declared. It had crept into her heart over time, subtle and unannounced. It had begun the moment she stopped wishing for his ruin and started wishing for her own peace. Later that week, a storm swept through the city. The rain fell hard against the windows, and thunder rolled like the sound of a closing chapter. Amara stayed late at the office, reviewing proposals. When she finally gathered her things and stepped outside, she found a figure waiting near her car, drenched in rain. It took her a moment to recognize him. Ethan. He looked nothing like the man she remembered. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by a rain-soaked coat. His face was leaner, paler, the arrogance stripped away. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain filled the silence between them. Amara finally spoke. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said quietly, "but I had nowhere else to go." Her instinct was to leave, to walk past him, and never look back. But something in his voice stopped her. It was not pride or manipulation. It was exhaustion. He looked like a man standing at the edge of himself. She folded her umbrella and stood still. "What do you want, Ethan?" He hesitated, searching for words. "Not forgiveness, not sympathy. I just wanted to see you, to understand how you did it, how you survived what I tried to destroy." Amara met his gaze. "I stopped surviving. I started living. That's the difference." He swallowed hard, rain dripping from his hair. "You built something incredible. They say the Lu Foundation is changing lives. You did what I never could. You could have," she said, "but you chose power over purpose." Ethan looked down, his voice breaking slightly. "I know. I thought winning meant never losing control, but I lost everything that mattered trying to prove I couldn't fail." Amara's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "You still can build something, Ethan, but not from the ruins of others. You have to start with yourself." He looked at her then, truly looked, and she saw something unfamiliar in his eyes, humility. It was fragile and raw, but real. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city lights blurred through the rain, turning the street into a canvas of reflections. Finally, Ethan stepped back. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not destroying me when you could have." Amara's voice was calm. "I didn't want your destruction. I wanted your understanding." He nodded once, then turned and walked into the rain. She watched him go until his figure disappeared into the storm. For the first time, she felt no bitterness, no lingering ache, only a strange stillness, as if the past had finally exhaled. The next morning, the news confirmed what everyone had already known. Ethan Moreau had resigned from his final position. His name would no longer appear in the headlines. The empire was gone. But unlike before, Amara felt no satisfaction in reading it. It was simply the end of a story that had run its course. Weeks passed. The world moved on. Amara continued her work, expanding the foundation, mentoring young women, and building bridges in places where hope had once been scarce. Each success reminded her that purpose was far more enduring than pride. One afternoon, as she stood in the new training center her foundation had built, she watched a group of women presenting their projects with bright eyes and trembling voices. She felt a quiet swell of emotion rise within her. This, she thought, was what power was meant to create. Opportunity, not fear. When the presentations ended, Clara approached her with a smile. "They all look up to you," she said. Amara smiled faintly. "I don't want them to look up to me. I want them to look forward." That evening, she returned home and stood by the window of her penthouse. The city stretched beneath her, golden and endless. Somewhere out there, Ethan was beginning again, invisible to the world but perhaps finally visible to himself. She wished him peace, not as an act of mercy, but as an act of release. She poured herself a glass of water and opened her notebook. On a clean page, she wrote a single line. "Peace is not born from victory, but from letting go." Then she closed it, her reflection merging with the night outside. In the distance, Thunder murmured one last time before fading into silence. The storm was gone, and the city breathed again. Amara Lu stood alone in the quiet, not as the woman who had been broken or the one who had rebuilt, but as both. The fall had come and gone, and through it, she had learned the most powerful truth of all, that true strength is not in rising above others, but in standing whole after the world has tried to tear you apart. The morning sun spilled across the city like a quiet promise. The glass towers glowed golden, and the streets below pulsed with movement, unaware of how many stories of loss and rebirth were hidden within their shadows. Amara stood in her office, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the light climb over the skyline. The Lu Foundation had grown far beyond what she had imagined when it began in a single room with second-hand furniture and stubborn hope. Now it reached across continents, funding programs for education, healthcare, and small businesses run by women who had once been told they were powerless. The success was steady and honest. No headlines were screaming her name, no spotlights or grand ceremonies. That was how she preferred it. Her joy was in the quiet victories, the emails of gratitude, the photographs of women holding their first business permits, the laughter that filled the hallways of the new community centers they had built. It was a symphony of resilience, and she was content to conduct it from the background. That morning, Jacob entered the office with a folder in hand, and the same calm efficiency that had carried them through everything. He set the folder down and smiled. The new expansion proposal is ready. Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe. It's ambitious, but achievable. Amara nodded, flipping through the documents. You've done good work, Jacob. All of you have. He hesitated. You've done more. She looked up, her eyes soft but firm. None of this exists without the people who believed in it. That's the difference between an empire and a legacy. One demands loyalty, the other inspires it. He smiled, as if he understood something more profound than her words. When he left, Amara turned her attention back to the window. The city was alive, unstoppable. She had once felt crushed beneath its indifference, but now she saw it for what it was, a canvas that gave meaning to those brave enough to paint on it. Later that afternoon, Clara arrived unannounced, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. You look too serious for someone who's changing the world, she said with a grin. Amara laughed softly. Changing the world is serious work. Clara set the flowers on the desk. Maybe so, but it's also beautiful work. Do you ever stop to breathe, Amara? Sometimes, she said, but the air feels different now, lighter. Clara studied her. You've forgiven him, haven't you? Amara paused, then smiled faintly. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to someone else. It's the door you open for yourself. They sat together, talking about small things, books, travel, and dreams yet to come true. The conversation drifted easily, carrying with it the comfort of years of friendship. Outside, the light softened into gold, stretching long shadows across the office floor. As the day faded into evening, Amara found herself walking alone through the city. She passed the places that once held fragments of her old life. The cafe where she had scribbled her first ideas, the narrow street where she had wept after leaving Ethan, the bookstore where she had bought her first notebook. Each place had once carried a weight of pain. Now they felt like old songs whose melodies she still remembered, but no longer needed to sing. When she reached the riverside, she stopped. The water shimmered beneath the setting sun, and the breeze carried the scent of rain and steel. She leaned against the railing, watching the reflections ripple across the surface. Behind her, a voice spoke softly. "I didn't think you'd come here again." She turned. Ethan stood a few feet away, his posture tentative, as if uncertain whether he was welcome. He looked different, calmer, older, but lighter somehow, as though he had laid down something heavy. "I didn't come here for you," she said gently. "I know. I didn't come to ask anything, either." He stepped closer, keeping his distance respectful. "I started working with a local startup, small team, renewable energy projects. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." Amara nodded. "That's good." He smiled faintly. "I thought I'd hate being ordinary. Turns out it's peaceful." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the river. The years between them felt vast, but not hostile, just full of everything that had needed to happen. Ethan broke the silence. "I never said I was sorry, not properly." "You don't have to," she said. "I already accepted it." He looked at her, the wind tugging at his coat. "You were always stronger than me. I see that now." She shook her head. "No, Ethan, I just learned faster." He smiled, sad and sincere. "Take care of yourself, Amara. You deserve peace, and you deserve to find yours," she replied. He nodded once and turned to leave. As he walked away, the light of the sunset caught his silhouette, blurring it into gold before it disappeared into the crowd. She watched him go, feeling no sadness, only closure. When she finally turned back to the river, the city lights had begun to awaken, scattering their reflections across the darkening water. She thought of the countless women whose lives now carried traces of her work, each one a ripple spreading outward, unseen but unstoppable. That night, she returned home and poured herself a glass of wine. Her penthouse was filled with soft light and the quiet hum of the city below. On her desk lay the old notebook once more. She opened it to the first page, running her fingers over the words written years ago. "From ashes, we rise." Beneath it, she wrote another line. "From light, we live." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Amara woke early, long before the city stirred. She made her way to the rooftop terrace where the wind was crisp and the world stretched endlessly below her. She closed her eyes and let the sun warm her face. This, she thought, is what freedom feels like. Not the absence of pain, but the acceptance of it. Her phone buzzed with messages from her team, updates, questions, new opportunities. She smiled and began to type responses, her movements fluid and sure. Life, with all its demands and imperfections, awaited her once again. Hours later, as she left for another meeting, she caught her reflection in the elevator mirror. The woman looking back was no longer the one who had stood trembling in humiliation, nor the one who had fought with cold determination. She was something else entirely, whole, balanced, alive. As the elevator doors opened, she stepped out and walked into the day. The city greeted her with its noise, its beauty, its chaos. And somewhere in that chaos, Amara Lou found peace, not as a destination, but as a constant state of becoming. For the first time, she no longer felt the need to rise from ashes. She was already standing in the light. The sun climbed slowly over the horizon, spilling light across the new Lou Foundation headquarters. The building stood at the heart of the city, a structure of glass and soft steel that reflected both the past and the promise of what was to come. Inside, the air carried a quiet energy, the kind born not from chaos but from purpose. The hallways buzzed with conversation, with laughter, with the sound of people building something larger than themselves. Amara walked through the lobby, surrounded by the hum of life she had helped create, and the years had settled on her gently, adding grace to her calm authority. Her hair was now tied in a sleek knot, and her white suit, elegant and straightforward, had become something of a quiet symbol among her team. People paused as she passed, not out of fear, but out of respect. "Morning, Miss Lou," one of the young interns greeted her shyly. "Morning," Amara replied with a warm smile. "No one calls me Miss Lou anymore, just Amara." She stepped into the elevator, heading to the top floor where the new project committee awaited. As the doors closed, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her carried the same eyes she had once seen in the broken reflection of that night at the gala. Only now they were steady, unflinching, filled with light instead of fire. The meeting began as soon as she entered. Jacob was already there, seated beside Hale, who had become more like family than an ally. Clara joined through a video call from their European office, her face glowing with her usual warmth. "We have the final proposal," Jacob began. "The board unanimously supports expanding the mentorship network globally." Hale nodded. "We've come full circle, Amara. What you once started for one city will now reach millions." Amara smiled, her hands folded neatly on the table. "It isn't me, it's all of us. Every woman who stood up when the world told her to stay down. Every person who believed in second chances." Clara's voice came through the screen softly. You always say that, Amara, but you forget. Someone had to believe first. Amara said nothing, but the truth of those words filled the room like sunlight. After the meeting, Hale lingered as the others left. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "You've spent years building for others. Maybe it's time you think about what comes next for you." Amara tilted her head. "This is what's next for me." He shook his head. After this. What legacy do you want when you step back someday?" She smiled faintly. "Legacy isn't about stepping back. It's about stepping aside so others can lead." He studied her, a trace of admiration in his expression. "You've become everything they said you couldn't be." She looked out the window at the city below, alive and endless. "I just stopped listening." Later that week, Amara visited one of the Foundation's newest community centers. The building was modest, surrounded by gardens and murals painted by local children. Inside, a group of young women were gathered in a circle, sharing stories about their businesses, their dreams, and the struggles they faced. When Amara entered, the room fell into quiet awe. One of the women, a girl no older than 20, stood up and approached her. "Miss Amara," she said shyly, "we wanted to thank you. Without your program, none of us would be here." Amara smiled gently. "You would still be here, maybe not in this room, but in the world. You just needed someone to remind you that you could be." The girl hesitated, then asked softly, "How did you keep going when it felt impossible?" Amara thought for a moment before answering. "I remembered that impossible things are only impossible until someone proves otherwise." When she left the center that afternoon, the air was warm and golden. She paused outside, watching the young women through the windows. Their laughter floated out into the open air, full of hope and certainty. She realized then that the Foundation no longer belonged to her. It belonged to them, the heirs of the dream she had once built from ruin. That night, as she walked along the river, she saw a small crowd gathered near the steps by the water. Curious, she moved closer. A group of volunteers were setting lanterns afloat, each one glowing softly as it drifted away on the current. It was a local festival, a celebration of gratitude and remembrance. An older woman offered Amara a lantern. "For someone who changed your life," she said kindly. Amara smiled and accepted it. She knelt by the edge of the river, the lantern warm in her hands. For a moment, she thought of Ethan, not with bitterness but with quiet acknowledgement. He had been the storm that tore everything apart, but he had also been the fire that forced her to rebuild stronger. She whispered to the water, "Thank you for teaching me who I never want to be." Then she released the lantern. It floated away, joining hundreds of others, their reflections shimmering on the surface like stars scattered across the earth. She stood there for a long while, the night settling around her like peace made visible. Somewhere deep inside she felt something close, a sense of completion, not of endings, but of arrival. When she returned home, she found a letter waiting on her desk. The handwriting was unfamiliar but elegant. She opened it carefully. "Dear Miss Liu, I was one of the scholarship recipients from your foundation. I wanted to thank you, but not just for the opportunity. Thank you for showing me that pain can become purpose. My mother told me your story. She said that when the world breaks you, you can choose to rebuild yourself into something unbreakable. I think I understand now." It was signed simply, "With Hope, L. Moreau." Amara froze, the name lingering like a ghost made of memory and redemption. Leona, Ethan's daughter. She had vanished from the public eye after her father's fall, and now here she was, an echo of the past finding its way back through the light. Amara folded the letter slowly, her eyes misted but calm. She placed it beside her notebook and whispered to the empty room, "So the circle begins again." She walked to the window and looked out over the city. The horizon shimmered with the first lights of dawn, soft and unending. She thought of the women who would come after her, of the lives yet to be changed, of the hearts that would heal because one woman had refused to stay broken. For the first time, Amara felt truly at peace. Her story was no longer about survival or revenge or even redemption. It was about creation, about what could be built when one dared to rise from ashes and walk into the light. She whispered one final truth to the morning air. Hope is the only empire worth building. And as the city awoke beneath her, the sun rose higher, bathing everything it touched in gold. The day began with quiet. The city stretched beneath a pale sky, the first light brushing against rooftops like a gentle awakening. From the top floor of the Lu Foundation headquarters, Amara watched the world unfold. The office was still, the hum of morning activity yet to begin. She stood by the window, holding a cup of coffee, its warmth seeping through her hands. The view below seemed endless, cars streaming like silver threads, the river gleaming in the distance, life moving in its steady rhythm. It had been 10 years since she founded the Lu Foundation. 10 years since the night that had torn her life apart and set her on a path she could never have imagined. Now, her name was known in circles that once ignored her. Awards lined her shelves, articles praised her vision, and her foundation had become a symbol of change across the world. But for Amara, recognition was only a shadow of meaning. What mattered were the people, the faces of those whose lives had been touched, the laughter of the women who no longer feared tomorrow. She set her cup down and turned as Clara entered, holding a file and her ever-present smile. "You're up early," she said. "I never sleep much before anniversaries," Amara replied. Clara placed the file on the desk. "It's hard to believe it's been a decade. The Foundation's story has become a legend." Amara chuckled softly. "Legends are for those who stop moving. We still have work to do." Clara grinned, spoken like someone who refuses to age. Amara smiled but said nothing. There were days when she felt every year, every sleepless night, every decision that had carried both weight and grace. Yet there was also something timeless about her now. A serenity that came not from victory, but from acceptance. As the day unfolded, preparations for the Foundation's anniversary event filled the building with energy. Staff moved through hallways carrying decorations, adjusting lights, testing microphones. The air buzzed with anticipation. Amara observed it all quietly, her mind half in the present, half in memory. In the afternoon, Jacob entered her office with updates. "The media is already outside," he said. "You'll have cameras, dignitaries, donors, everyone you've inspired in one room." "I didn't build this alone," Amara reminded him. He nodded. "But you built the reason it exists." When the evening came, the Foundation's atrium transformed into a glowing expanse of light and color. The glass walls reflected golden chandeliers, and soft music drifted through the air. Guests arrived dressed in elegance, their conversations warm and admiring. Every corner held a story, photographs of projects completed, testimonials displayed on screens, and portraits of women from across the world whose lives had been reshaped by the Foundation's reach. Amara stepped onto the stage as the crowd quieted. The lights caught her face, and for a moment she stood still, taking in the sea of expectant eyes. She could feel the pulse of the moment, the weight of everything she had endured and everything she had become. She began softly. 10 years ago, I stood in a room very different from this one. It was small, empty, and silent. I had nothing but an idea and a reason to keep going. I didn't know if anyone would believe in it, but I knew I had to try. The audience listened, rapt. "What I've learned," she continued, "is that the hardest thing you'll ever do is forgive the world for breaking you. But once you do, you discover something extraordinary. The pieces left behind are stronger than the whole ones." Applause filled the room, but she lifted her hand gently. This foundation was never built on revenge or redemption. It was built on responsibility. The responsibility to believe in possibility when no one else does. The commitment to create light when you've lived too long in darkness. She paused, her gaze sweeping the audience. Every woman we've helped, every child who now dreams because someone believed in her, that is our true wealth. That is our legacy. The applause came again, louder this time, echoing through the glass walls, but Amara's smile was quiet, almost wistful. After the speeches ended and the music resumed, she stepped away from the crowd, moving toward the balcony that overlooked the city. The night stretched before her, endless and luminous. She took a deep breath, the cool air carrying the faint hum of celebration behind her. She wasn't alone for long. Hale approached slowly, leaning on his cane, his eyes kind. "You've done well," he said simply. "We've done well," Amara corrected. He chuckled. "You still can't take a compliment." She turned to face him. "You taught me that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about listening to the quiet ones." He nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you hear now, Amara?" She looked back at the city, her voice almost a whisper. "I hear peace. I hear the sound of something lasting." Hale smiled faintly. "Then your work is complete." "No," she said. "Legacy is never complete. It just changes hands." He regarded her for a long moment, then nodded and left her to her thoughts. A soft breeze brushed against her face. She closed her eyes and thought of the girl she had once been, the one who stood alone outside the gala, humiliated and heartbroken. She wanted to tell that girl that everything she lost would one day lead her here, that every cruel word would become fuel, every tear a seed. But the past no longer needed reassurance. It had already served its purpose. Later that night, as the guests departed and the lights dimmed, Amara found herself walking through the empty atrium. Her footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor. She stopped by a framed photograph on the wall, a picture of the first women the foundation had ever supported. They stood together in a dirt courtyard, smiling, their eyes bright with hope. Amara reached out and touched the glass. The warmth of the memory filled her chest. Behind her, Clara's voice broke the silence. "You know, they'll write books about you one day." Amara smiled. "Then make sure they write about them instead." Clara nodded. "You really mean it, don't you?" "Of course. What's the point of lighting a flame if it only burns for you?" When Clara left, Amara remained, standing in the quiet glow of the hall. The world she had built was vast, but it was not hers to keep. It was a living thing, a force that would grow beyond her reach. And that, she realized, was the actual weight of legacy. Not holding on, but letting go. As midnight approached, she stepped outside into the cool night. The city lights shimmered below like constellations scattered across the earth. Somewhere, far away, new beginnings were taking shape, new voices rising, new hands building, new hearts daring to believe. Amara Lou smiled softly, her reflection blending with the horizon. The woman who had once been broken was now infinite, not because she had conquered the world, but because she had learned how to give it back its hope. And above the sleeping city, the first light of dawn began to bloom again. The morning came soft and gold, a whisper of light sliding through the curtains of Amara's apartment. The city stretched awake beneath her window, breathing in rhythm with the pulse of a world she had helped reshape. It was one of those mornings that felt like both an ending and a beginning, the air heavy with the scent of rain, and something new waiting just beyond the horizon. Amara sat at her desk, the same one she had bought when the Liu Foundation was just an idea scribbled on paper and hope. On its surface lay her old notebook, its cover worn smooth by years of use. She opened it and ran her fingers across the first page, where the words, "From ashes we rise," had been written a lifetime ago. The ink was faded now, but the meaning was brighter than ever. The phone buzzed softly beside her. Clara's voice came through, warm and familiar. "The conference in Geneva starts in 2 days," she said. "The team has everything ready. Are you sure you're not coming in person?" Amara smiled faintly. It's time they speak without me. They've earned it." Clara hesitated. "The world still listens when you speak, Amara." "Then let them listen to someone new," she replied gently. When the call ended, Amara closed her notebook and stood. The city outside shimmered in the early light, and for the first time in years, she felt no pull toward her office, no urgency to plan or decide. Instead, there was stillness, the kind that comes only when the journey has come full circle. She spent the morning walking through the streets she once feared she would never belong to again. The cafe where she had once written her first proposal still stood on the corner. The same waiter, now older, greeted her with a smile that carried quiet recognition. She sat by the window, ordered black coffee, and watched people pass by. There was beauty in their ordinary movement, the laughter of a couple crossing the street, the small hand of a child gripping her mother's coat, the hum of life simply continuing. For years, she had built, fought, and healed. But today she allowed herself to exist simply. When she finished her coffee, she walked toward the river. The water moved lazily under the afternoon sun, reflecting the skyline like a painting in motion. A group of students nearby were sketching, their laughter bright and unburdened. One of them recognized her and hesitated before approaching. "Excuse me, are you Amara Lou?" Amara turned, her smile gentle. "I used to be." The girl blinked, confused, then smiled shyly. "I study social entrepreneurship. Your work, it changed everything for us." Amara nodded. "Then change it again. Make it better." The girl's eyes widened. "How?" "By remembering that the world doesn't need saviors," Amara said softly. "It needs believers." The student thanked her and hurried back to her friends. Amara watched them for a while, the sound of their laughter floating in the air like a melody she once knew. Then she continued walking along the riverbank until she reached the small park at its edge. There, on a weathered bench beneath a tree heavy with blossoms, sat a familiar figure, Ethan Moreau. He looked up as she approached, surprise flickering across his face before softening into something like peace. "You always did know where to find quiet," he said, "and you always found me there," she replied. She sat beside him, leaving a polite space between them. Time had changed him. His hair had turned silver at the temples, and the once sharp arrogance in his eyes had faded into reflection. He carried himself like a man who had learned to live with himself, not against himself. "I didn't expect to see you again," Amara said. "I didn't plan to," he admitted, "but I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For not letting me stay the man I was." She looked at him for a long moment. "Redemption doesn't come from others, Ethan. It comes from the choices you make when no one's watching." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe I finally learned something. I run a small foundation now. Renewable projects, education for underprivileged kids. Nothing like yours, but it's honest work." Amara smiled faintly. "Honest work is the only kind that matters." They sat in silence, watching the petals drift down onto the river's surface. The years between them felt distant, softened by understanding. Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter. "Leona graduates next month. She told me she met you once. She said you gave her something to believe in." Amara looked toward the horizon. She gave that to herself. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You changed so many lives, Amara, even mine." She turned to him. "I didn't change you, life did. I just showed you the mirror." He chuckled softly. "Always the philosopher." "Always the survivor," she replied. They talked a little longer about nothing and everything until the sun began to dip below the skyline. When they finally stood to leave, Ethan extended his hand. "Thank you," he said again. Amara took it. "Be well, Ethan. You too." He walked away slowly, disappearing into the golden light. She watched until he was gone, then turned back to the river. The water caught the last shimmer of daylight, the reflection of the city glowing like fire before fading into dusk. That night, she returned home and opened her notebook once more. She flipped to the final blank page, her pen hovering for a long time before moving. We rise, we fall, we build, we give. In the end, it is not the empire that matters, but the hearts we leave open when we go. She closed the book, feeling the weight of completion settle gently around her. The next morning, she boarded a train bound for the countryside. The city fell away behind her, replaced by rolling hills and fields of gold. She had no destination, only a direction. The rhythm of the tracks was soothing, steady, familiar. As the train moved forward, Amara rested her head against the window and let her eyes close. When she woke, the world outside had turned to light. Villages passed by, children waved from distant roads, and the horizon stretched endlessly. For the first time in her life, there was no plan waiting ahead. No battle to fight, no mountain to climb, only the quiet knowing that she had done what she came to do. Amara Liu, the woman who had once been broken, betrayed, and reborn, smiled softly to herself. The circle was complete. The ashes had become light, and the light had become legacy. As the train carried her toward the horizon, the sun rose higher, bathing the earth in warmth. And in that moment, neither past nor future. She finally belonged entirely to the present.